I actually view teaching as a creative outlet for me. I don't draw, I don't paint, but finding a way to make someone understand and then learn how to do something is a neat challenge for me. I enjoy it.
Off Gassing, a scuba podcast with host Nick Hogel. From a very early age, Neal Pollock knew he wanted to be a diver. Having developed a love for the aquatic environment, it was only natural for him to find his way to diving. A love for teaching was discovered through his aquatic hobbies. This has developed into a distinguished career, having participated in multiple studies all over the world. It was amazing to have Neal back on the podcast to hear more about some of his most memorable moments underwater, public speaking, ice diving, and much more. Please enjoy. Neal, how are you doing this morning?
Very well.
Okay, how's the weather over there for you? A little cold, I'm assuming.
Well, actually, in Quebec, we've had a fairly mild winter so far. We've had many days where it's above freezing, and Christmas had no snow. But today we were down to minus 15 Celsius, so it's a little chilly.
I don't know how I can handle in those cold weather situations. I was before I moved out of Texas, and this is Texas cold, not Quebec cold. I was like, I can't deal with these cold weather days anymore. But it actually started getting, we were getting some pretty harsh winters the last few winters I was there. But I want to thank you for coming on to the podcast again. And I really appreciate you willing to participate. And I'm excited to hear about your story.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
So my first question that I want to ask you is, tell me about that first breath underwater. Tell me about what led to it, what the experience was like. Was it love at first breath? Was it, I hate this, I'm never doing this again? Tell me all about it.
Well, my first breath actually doesn't start with diving. It starts with aquatics in general. I fell in love with swimming very early at about 5. And I grew up in Alberta, cold province. And so we spent a lot of time at the pool. So I started swimming. And then at 8, I got interested in competitive swimming. So I started that at 9. And at that point, for me, a lot of it was aquatics. It was a split between my bike in the summer and swimming year round. And I remember reading a bunch of at the time, the dollar books that were high adventure, deep sea diving books. And so I just loved it. So from an early age, it was good. I wanted to be a diver from about age 8 or 9. And I know my mother took me to a dive shop at one point, probably around age 13. And the person we spoke to, I think intelligently said, "Ooh, you should wait until you're a little bit older so you're ready." And I listened to that. And so I started diving when I was 17. And it was a good time to do it. I was working as a swimming instructor and a lifeguard, and it was one of the last things in the water box that I needed to check off. And I loved it. So I was at the end of high school, I started diving, and it fit with the water side. And it also gave me an idea for the future. So I ended up going into my bachelor degree in zoology marine science, in part because of the love of the diving. And so everything really came together for me in that regard. Coming out of the zoology marine science degree, I didn't want to work as a lab tech. That was pretty much all you were qualified for with that degree. And I didn't want to volunteer for the 2 or 3 years I thought it would take to get a graduate student slot. So perhaps ironically, I ended up spending as many years working in the diving field. Because what I found when I came out of my degree is that I really liked the biology, the physiology, the natural history, and I loved teaching. To give you a little bit more backstory, I taught for the first time when I was in grade 10. I'd been a competitive swimmer, and in phys ed classes, there was a swimming session or a period, 2 weeks of swimming, and there was nothing I was going to learn with that. So the teacher had me teaching the grade 12 students. And I truly realized from the first day I taught that I would always teach because I just loved it. It definitely clicked.
What did you love about it if you don't mind me asking, like what was the draw to it?
I actually view teaching as a creative outlet for me. I don't draw, I don't paint, but finding a way to make someone understand and then learn how to do something is a neat challenge for me. I enjoy it. And
Okay.
for whatever reason, it just resonated. And so when I was coming out of my bachelor's degree, I had the interest in teaching, I had the interest in diving, I had no interest in working in a lab. And so I ended up spending the next 3 or 4 years working in the diving industry. And because I had the background in science, I'd spent 2 summers at a marine lab doing scientific work in diving. I was able to offer a little bit different focus to someone who's just teaching you how to blow bubbles. And from that, I became the diving officer at the University of British Columbia. And that was absolutely plum. As part of that role, I started teaching. So I became an instructor at the university at the age of 22, which was kind of cool. And it just from there led one experience to the next to the next. I'd been in the job of diving officer for 5 years, and it was a permanent position in the health and safety department. And I could have stayed, but I felt I was losing my edge. I wasn't quite as excited about the days. And at the time, I was invited to come to Florida to coordinate the data collection on a field study. A chamber study had been done at Duke University looking at surface interval oxygen breathing on the ability to reduce decompression stress. NOAA wanted to find a way to reduce the time spent between dives because they're spending tens of thousands of dollars a day for a ship to be on hold while people have to decompress or have a surface interval. And so we used oxygen breathing during the surface interval to accelerate the inert gas elimination. Well, a chamber study was done at Duke, and then field studies were going to be done in Florida. And because I had been down at Florida as a diving officer, they asked if I was interested in coming down and running the study, or coordinating the study. Not certainly not running the study alone; it was a big group, but coordinating the data collection. And I found out that I could turn that into a tuition waiver to do a doctoral program. And so I went. And I'm sorry that I'm putting this out of order, but while I was diving officer, I was waiting for the diving officer position at UBC to come up. I started working on my master's. And when I got the position, I finished my master's. So that was done. And after 5 years in the position, when the opportunity of pursuing a doctorate with a funded start, it seemed like a good idea. So I had planned when I left UBC, I planned to be gone 3 to 5 years. I would finish the PhD and I would come back to Vancouver because Vancouver is a lovely place to live. But life doesn't work out the way you plan. So when I finished my PhD, I was trying to find a way to get to Duke because I had the ties then at Duke and they had interesting projects there. And I ended up teaching in two different universities for 1 year stints. Well, I guess 2 years at one at another, and working at Duke part time. Basically, it was really just a situation of going from one opportunity to the next, doing what felt right, and trying to make what I loved fit into it. And I ended up staying at Duke for almost 19 years. When you look at the total sum here, I was going to be gone from Canada 3 to 5 years, and we're up to year 26. So, all right. But I loved it. The opportunities at Duke and Dan were fantastic. I was able to go all around the world, have lots of opportunities both in the research and the teaching side. It was fantastic. And then in 2016, I was approached by a group in Quebec to take on the research chair, a newly developed research chair in hyperbaric and diving medicine. It was at the time the first one in North America. And I had always wanted to come back to Canada. I never thought about coming to Quebec because I'm an Anglophone, but they came to me, surely it'll be okay. And the opportunity to take on the research chair was just way too interesting. So, as usual in my life, I have a strong belief that knowing the right thing is easy. It's learning to live with a decision that's hard. And because of that, I have learned to pretty much jump when I decide something is the right thing. So I don't worry too much about getting comfortable with it. I just say, yeah, that's the right thing. I'm going to do it. And that's why I came to Quebec. And so now I'm back to a little bit more seasonal diving because in the winter it gets a little bit solid. So you can definitely go through the ice, but it's more work. But that's all fun. I mean, these opportunities. To give you another example, when I was diving officer at UBC, I had met the diving officer at Scripps Institution because they were running ice diving training in Winnipeg for RCMP divers, the police divers, and so I joined them. And there had been an accident, a fatal accident of a scientific diver in the Antarctic in 1989. Oh, pardon me, in 1987. And so in 1989, they wanted the research to continue, but the powers that be wanted to make sure that the divers had more ice experience because the diver who died was an experienced Californian scientific diver, but not an experienced ice diver. And so I came into my office once in late 1989, I think. And the secretary, we had secretaries at that point, she said, "You've got to listen to a call that came in on the overnight message line." And I said, "Okay." Message was, "This is Dr. Joan Bernhardt from Scripps Institution. We'd like to offer you a contract to dive in the Antarctic." And secretary looked at me and said, "You're not going to." I said, "Of course I'm going to." And so that day, I requested a leave of absence to spend 3 months to join a dive team on the ice. And I was able to go back for a total of 6 seasons. And those opportunities are just fantastic. So while I was doing my PhD, I would take off the occasional semester and dive on the ice. And in fact, my data collection was largely on the ice. So the point of this mishmash is that I think of my path as very crooked. I think of life as a web. There's an infinite number of pathways you can get to the same endpoint. And the trick for me is to say yes to the opportunities that seem reasonable and then do as well as you can because that will inevitably lead to the
Oh,
next
okay.
invitation or opportunity. So that's my crooked path.
That doesn't sound like a bad path. That's actually very, very interesting. So ice diving, like, tell me a little bit about that. I've never been ice diving. I'm very curious about it. Obviously, you were drawn to it, just being from where you're from. I'm assuming you probably enjoy some cold water diving, and that's probably taking it to the extent.
It is. First thing you have to understand is people who are intelligent may enjoy the cold. I enjoy the cold, but I don't enjoy being cold. So the trick is finding a way to do these things while maintaining comfort. And you can. When I started, I think in 1979 or 80, I guess 1980, was the first time I ice dived. And there are two types of ice diving. The typical ice diving you do for experience or training, you're usually in a lake, you have ice that's usually between 8 and 16 inches. You cut a nice, neat triangular hole. You have neat, orderly lines attached to the primary and secondary diver, and everything is tightly controlled. That's what most people experience with ice diving. In the Antarctic, it's very different. There, we're diving between anywhere between 6 and 20 feet of ice. And if you're very close to McMurdo Station, you can use a big drill to make a 1 meter wide diameter hole. But if you're further away, you open your holes with explosives. So it's a completely different kind of situation. And you have a master blaster who comes out and you start with a 4 inch jiffy drill hole and you pack it with explosives, and the first shot blows out the bottom of the hole, the second shot blows out the top of the hole, and then a couple of clearing charges pulverize the ice in the middle, so you end up hopefully with a hole that you can go through. And again, it can be as much as 20 feet of ice. So your safety stop or a decompression stop, if you're doing decompression diving, which is not normal in the Antarctic, all you do is you peg yourself under the ice and take a nap because you don't have to worry about holding your stop depth. You're under the ice. But so it's very different. And the other thing with polar diving, depending on your country, some programs like New Zealand do use line divers. they tend to allow people to dive who have priority science experience, but not necessarily that much diving experience. So they're always on lines and they always have a diving officer with them, basically to provide adult supervision to keep them alive. In the US program, it's quite different. There, you don't allow people to engage in the diving unless they have a substantial amount of experience. How that translates, you normally don't use lines in the US program. So when you go under the ice, unless there is current or bad visibility, neither of which is common in most of the sites where we would operate, you are a free swimming diver. We'll open up a main hole and at least one backup hole, often multiple backup holes. We'll put lines down each hole with a series of flashers, and we would go for a minimum of four. And the reason for the minimum of four is that the cold water
Oh.
kills the battery life. So you start with four and you hope that you have at least one at the end. So you're going down, you're moving freely, but you're able to get more done because you don't have to worry about the tether. Now, we do a fair bit of tether diving. We'll use full face masks or so a Kirby Morgan band mask or occasionally helmets. So sometimes we use those. So you're on an umbilical. But most of the diving is scuba, but it's untethered. So it's very different from the experience people have when they do the ice diving experience courses. But we do those here. We actually have one scheduled coming up the beginning of March. We'll spend a day opening up the holes and then 2 days letting people do the standard at least 15-minute dive to understand what it's like to be under the ice. And it's neat. Under the ice is interesting because the visibility tends to be fantastic. You have very little primary productivity, so your light is tremendous and it's a little bit dark if the ice is thick, but it's fun. So even here, it's nice. In the Antarctic, it's different because when you have 20 feet of ice, for example, it's so thick that you don't have much light penetrating. So
Oh,
each
wow.
dive is like a night dive. So we're down there when there's 24 hours of daylight, but we're actually doing the equivalent of night dives. But because no light is penetrating, there's again very little primary productivity. So the nominal visibility in the Antarctic under the ice is 800 feet. And when you have experienced 800-foot visibility, it spoils you for anywhere else on Earth. Most people go to the Caribbean or the Central Pacific, they get 150, 200, maybe 250 feet, and they think, oh my God, this is fantastic. Once you've been diving under the ice in the Antarctic, you see that visibility and you say, yeah, it's okay. Because you've had it so much better. We once did a dive, one of the memorable dives for me. We were diving at a place we hadn't dived before called Cape Evans, which is on Ross Island. And we were going in for a specific collection target. We finished our collection fairly quickly, and so we had some time. So I pointed to a rock to my buddy and said, hey, let's swim over to that rock. And he said, yeah, sure, that sounds like a great idea. Now, Cape Evans was different from where we normally dive because the ice was thinner, only about 6 feet thick, and it was more translucent, so more light got in. Whereas where we normally dived, there was more snow cover and sediment cover, so it was darker. So we started swimming towards that rock. We swam, we swam, we swam. We never got to the rock because it was too far away. Because we weren't aware of how big the rock was and it was a sediment bottom, we just
Oh,
had no
wow.
sense of scale. The visibility was so good that we just fooled ourselves. And that's the kind of thing that you don't normally experience. Normally, you see a rock, you have some sense of scale and distance. But when you're diving in truly gin clear water, it's a different experience. But it's life changing. I think truly diving in the Antarctic, those have been the most life changing dives I've had. It's just a neat challenge technically to go through the challenges to make them happen, to open the holes, to manage the cold, to get the work done. But it's truly a privilege to be able to do that. And that's how I view my life in diving. It's been a series of incredible opportunities that it would be hard to pay for and to be offered offered them, it's been
Oh
just
man,
such
that
fun.
sounds absolutely amazing. You're making me want to go ice dive.
I think everybody should. And you could do it as a bucket list thing, but realize when you go and you do the normal ice dive on a 50-foot tether, it's not what everybody experiences. There's a step that goes far beyond that. We started with those tethers and then moved on to free swimming diving, and it's a neat world under the ice. But even the first time you go, you might even get to water ski. You never know. You're on a tether, and if you communicate with your service tenders, you can tell them you're going to go out and give them the emergency signal. And before you do it, you stand upside down on the ice with the line between your legs. And when you give them the emergency signal and they pull you in as fast as they can, you can water ski under the ice upside
That's
down. So try to do that in any other diving environment. It just
that
won't happen.
sounds that sounds absolutely amazing. That is awesome. Question. So you've had a lot of opportunities. You were saying, have there what have been some highlight opportunities? I'm assuming obviously the ice diving is one. What would you rate up there as kind of some top moments that you've been a part of?
Yeah, that's a good question. People often say, what is your favorite dive? What's your favorite area? And I always come back with, it depends on the kind of diving you're talking about. I'll give you a few examples. My favorite night dive ever was actually in British Columbia. We were on a 28-foot boat. We were moored off a rock, and it was, I think if I recall correctly, it was New Year's Eve that we were diving there. So the water was cold in British Columbia. That means in the winter 6 to 8 degrees C. So it's chilly, but it's certainly not polar conditions. But we went down to the bottom, and the visibility in BC is not fantastic. It's called the Emerald Sea for a reason. It's green, it's beautiful primary productivity, so lots of life, but the visibility is not stellar. But this was one of those rare times where we went down to the bottom at 80 feet and we
Oh
could actually
wow.
see the moon. And that was cool. I had never experienced that kind of visibility. But the neatest thing, on the way up, we had bull kelp, Nereus cistus lutkiana, and if you turned all your lights off and you tugged on the bull kelp on the bottom, it would look like somebody was throwing rocks down into the water. And it's because as you tugged on the kelp, it moved all the way up. And as it moved, the bioluminescence would be activated and it
Oh.
looked like a rock was being thrown down. And that was just the neatest effect. And so I'd say that's probably my favorite night dive. The Antarctic is my favorite ice diving. In terms of wreck diving, it might be Truck Lagoon just because the water is so warm. It's the antithesis. You can go in just a rash guard as long as you're careful. And you can be in there for 2.5 hours and have no thermal stress whatsoever. For colder water diving that's exceptional, I would say New Zealand. Fiordland is one of my absolute favorite places. The water temperature is usually about 14 degrees C. And so if you go in with a dry suit and decent undergarments, you can do again a long run time and be perfectly thermoneutral. And the fjords are beautiful because there aren't too many people who dive there. And so the life is fairly undisturbed. You can go down and it's a incredibly rich environment. And I've been fortunate to be down there quite a few times, and we've sometimes had some folks who've been either fisher folk or spear fishers with us. I tend to prefer my wildlife alive, so I tend to watch and I'm happy to take pictures, but I don't do much collecting anymore. But on some of these trips, we would be enjoying the dives the way we did, but we'd come to the surface and we had the fishermen bringing up fish or other people collecting. And so each meal has fresh seafood. That's a really nice balance where I don't have to collect them. I don't have to clean them, but I get to enjoy them. And I enjoy the good diving. So I would say New Zealand, South Island of New Zealand, is fantastic for the undisturbed nature. It's cool there because you can get in by road and boat, but most people take a helicopter in to Fiordland. There are only two places where a helicopter can land. Then you spend the week on a liveaboard, and you'll often only see one other boat, two other boats in the whole week, and you feel like you are alone exploring the brave new world. And that's a fantastic place.
Oh man, that sounds yeah. So is it just since it's so remote, that's why a lot of people don't go there?
It is pretty remote. In Fiordland, a lot of people go to Milford Sound, which is developed as the tourist area. So there are tour boats, there's a lot of activity. But if you go to Breaksea, Dusky, or Doubtful Sound, it's much more difficult to get into any of them. And so you really are one of a very small group. There was only one liveaboard that was diving out of Doubtful Sound. And so it pretty much gives you that sense that I don't think we have had in North America since the 60s. Even when I started diving in the late 70s, you could go down some places and see big abalone, or you could see lingcod that were huge. You just don't see that anymore because most of those animals have been fished out of existence. The Fiordland in New Zealand is the probably the only place I've gone where it feels better than my earliest days of diving in Canada. And I think that's because there are just so few divers in that area. So it's truly exceptional.
Oh, okay, okay. So I actually I wanted to ask a question, something that you had mentioned at the beginning. You were saying that when you first were looking into getting diving, you were brought to a dive shop, and then they suggested that you should be a little bit older before you take a course. Do you feel that why and you happily agreed to it? Why do you feel that a person should be older before going into a course, or what was the reason that what was your reasoning behind that?
That's a great question. There are, of course, now lots of opportunities for kids to learn to blow bubbles. There's an interest in bringing people in early to try to keep them in the sport. I have a problem because many of the hazards we face in diving are invisible. And the best example is decompression stress. We don't have a fuel gauge or the equivalent of a gauge that indicates when nitrogen is accumulating in your tissues or when it's leaving your tissues. And so I believe that kids have the capability to develop fantastic physical skills, but they don't necessarily have the ability to appreciate the invisible hazards. And I can give you a good example of this. And so the problem, of course, a lot of people and parents will say, "Oh no, my kid's fantastic. You know, he has better entry or better neutral buoyancy than I have," and that's fine. But the skills are only part of it. So the example I like to use, there was a fellow who reported being on a boat, and there were two teenagers who were diving together on the boat. They were given a dive time. He went down. He was reaching the end of his dive time, and so he was starting to head up to the boat. When he was about to head up, he noticed two lights below him, and he almost blew it off. And he thought, "Oh no, there were a couple kids. I better check." And so he went down to 70 feet to find these two kids in dusky conditions with lights playing as lightsabers, having a fighting match at 70 feet. And so he told the kids, "Go up." And they basically blew him off. They said, "Go away, leave us alone. We're having fun. We don't care." And he couldn't. So he went up to them and he grabbed a pressure gauge. And I think, if I recall correctly, one was at 700 psi and one was at a little bit more. So these kids are quite deep, at least 70 feet, not paying any attention and having fun. And the fun is great, but the problem is you need the higher level thinking in diving to make sure that you're aware of your bottom time, where you are in the profile, when you have to go up, when you have to get out of there. And so I have taught, I've certified a couple of young people, and the best example of a person I certified, I started training him at 12, and it wasn't until he turned 15 and numerous trips that I was willing to certify him, because I believe that people who get the junior certifications don't necessarily get all the intellectual material they need. And the problem is, once you become an adult, you don't have to take more training. You just have to show a C card and sometimes a logbook showing that you have been experienced, and then you are automatically given a full certification. And so they may never have truly appreciated the invisible hazards, but they're able to move on to that full certification. And that's the problem I have. I think if somebody's going to dive with a kid and they're always going to take responsibility, that's fine. But there will come a point, because the skills of kids can be so strong, that you will be tempted to let them dive on their own or with a cohort. And that's when it's problematic, because then the kid comes out and the thinking diver may become less evident. So I do have a problem with kids diving, and I appreciate the fact that the fellow we spoke to encouraged me to wait, because I was a strong swimmer. There's no doubt that the skills would have been easy. But I remember when I started diving, it's funny now because I think a lot about decompression. I do a lot of work in the field of decompression. But when I took my open water course, the tables, then of course everything was table based. I remember it being a bit of a struggle to master the tables as quickly as I would have liked. The physical skills were easy, but I remember the tables being more of a challenge. And that's when I was 17 and a little bit more comfortable. I think the 12 or 13-year-old, they may go through the process, but I'm not sure that they truly capture it.
Okay. No, that's a valid point, because I even think people older than 17 or 12, in their mid 20s, when they start getting into the decompression side of it, it's just kind of like the lights are out. They're kind of like, oh, okay, they're just muddling through. Um, and I don't mean to get into this side of the conversation, but what are your thoughts on, because a lot of agencies now will just be like, oh, okay, just teach computers. If you don't mind me asking, what are your thoughts on that whole
Well,
scenario?
no, I'm fine to answer that. I think it's an important discussion. First off, it's important to remember that a table is just like a computer. It's just a single compartment computer. So it really is the same thing. Having said that, I believe that it makes a lot of sense to start with tables, because you can very clearly see the progression from start of dive, end of service interval, and the next dive. So I still believe there's great value in using the tables as an entry level demonstration to how the process works. But then going on to computers is fine. The problem, of course, is that you can't guarantee that the computer orientation you're going to give a student in a course will reflect the computer they end up diving with. And that's my real problem with doing computers alone. Now, some people on the marketing side could say, hey, no, this is good. We can keep them diving with us because they'll dive with our equipment. And that is a self serving approach, which I'm not a fan of, because I don't have to make my money by selling equipment or certifying divers anymore. So I believe that we should be thinking about what's in the best interests of the divers. And to me, the best interests of the divers are served by a fundamental understanding of the concepts that then they can then apply to any platform. So I would always start with tables to show them the concept, and then yes, teach them how to use the computer they're using, but they have to know enough about the concepts that they'll be able to move to a new computer platform if they choose to do so.
It is always like a tough situation, because it's like, because I remember in going into my open water course, as soon as we hit the decompression side, the tables and everything, it was just kind of like, man, this is a lot of information. Going into it, you're just like, oh, I'm gonna go learn a scuba dive, right? And then they start giving you all this information, and I'll be honest, it wasn't until later on until I realized how important all of that information is, like to know. And I'll full on admit, just going into the open water course, I was just like, hey, I'm gonna go be able to breathe underwater, this is amazing. And then they're giving me all this information, and I'm just like, do I really need to know this? And do you think that there's a way, like you're saying, that the a lot of the dangers are invisible, a lot of this knowledge, when you're kind of first learning it, you're like, oh, that might not apply to me, I'm gonna just go the occasional dive. Do you think there's a way to kind of get that information across in a better light, or to make it more, I don't want to say likable, that's the wrong word, but more approachable so that people are like, oh, I want to learn this.
Yes, there are definitely strategies. And now we're back to early on in the conversation. When you find someone who loves to teach and knows material, they will find a way to make it important to the students. And this is one of the problems we have in the industry. The standards are fairly low for becoming an instructor, and the standards are fairly low for training requirements. And so it comes down to the performance of the instructor to go beyond to really make sure that the understanding and the importance is appreciated by the students. You can do it. You can, with examples, with demonstrations, with stories, you can make people understand why things are important. The problem in diving is that a lot of the hard limits aren't so hard. We set decompression limits, but if you violate them, it doesn't mean there's a guaranteed bad outcome. The challenge is making people understand that we're setting limits because we truly don't know where a given dive will fall in terms of being higher relative risk or lower relative risk because of other factors. And so there's a calculus that has to be understood by students to realize that these aren't black and white rules, but they're in place to try to keep you safe. But you have to be mindful of other things that can alter your risk. A good instructor can impart that. A weaker instructor will just go through the basic material, check the box, and call you good to go. And that's what I have a problem with. I love teaching diving. I don't certify divers anymore because I think my time is better spent in the post certification training environment. But I never worked well in the let's just do 4 dives or 5 dives and certify someone camp. I really believe for me, it's important to teach to competency. And that's why I was good. When I was diving officer, I was doing a lot of teaching on the side, but I had a position that I could rely on for the money. And then the teaching was for pleasure, fun, satisfaction. And so I would tend to give people 12 dives before they would be certified. And I always tried to have at least 2 students so they could not only see what was hopefully my proper behavior, but they could also see their own errors and errors of their equal partner. Unfortunately, the current system is tough because there are financial constraints, what is required to make it work. But I believe the best instructors will still work very hard to make sure that students understand why things are important. Like it disappoints me when you say you didn't understand why these things were important when you finish your class. Do I need to know them? I get that, but as an instructor, it would disappoint me if a student left a class with that. What I want them to understand is yes, there are these limits and they're flexible and I can control the risk. And if I want to be safe, I stay the hell away from that limit, or I am very careful in what I do. I mean, I want people to kind of come out going, I don't have all the answers, but I have enough information that I can keep myself safe.
Yeah. Well, I didn't mean to come across like that, because I definitely, there was a huge emphasis on safety and don't do this. I just don't think I really grasped why not to do it. It's like, okay, I know not to do it, but why not
And
to
that
do it?
is the problem. That's the problem, Nick. I don't think that knowing a rule is anywhere close to as useful as understanding why the rule exists. It's the whys that we have to do a better job educating people about. And that's what, even if we can't get it at the certification level, we try to get it with post certification education. People get it by reading articles, by reading blogs, by doing any number of things, learning from others. But it's the whys that are most important. It goes back to that old anecdote. You can give a man a fish and feed him for a day, or you can teach a man to fish and feed him for a lifetime. That really is what we're talking about. If you just say to people, this is a limit for no, yes, they don't understand why. They can't apply it beyond a very narrow framework. And that's where people run into problems. I think it really is the responsibility of instructors to prepare people for scenarios that aren't quite so picture perfect. Because honestly, when do you have the picture perfect moments? You don't. So I think we have to teach people the whys so they can apply them.
No, I completely agree with it, and like I said, it's something that I'll speak about, and I nothing against my open water instructor. I had a great time going in, but just I think I didn't realize the seriousness of it until much later. But that's just because I was really trying to educate myself in just the factors of how serious things could be. Moving forward, we are at the start of a new year. Do you have any big plans for 2024?
Well, there are always running plans happening. The nice thing I mentioned, you do tend to get invitations to things, and it's always a pleasure to see the calendar start to fill up with some neat invitations. It's going to be a good year. We're slowly moving back to travel. I'm not going to be doing as much travel as I did pre-COVID, but I think that's a good thing. When I was at Duke and Dan, I was doing 20 to 24 trips a year, and that was a little bit too much. Now I'm trying to keep it to 12 to 14 trips a year, and that's good. So we've got some fun ones happening. There will be some ice diving. We've got a rebreather conference happening in Ponza, Italy in May. That will be fun. There are a few things going on, and I like to travel. I love to travel. So opportunities that get you out to new areas or return to old favorites are fun. And I'll be disappointed if those invitations stop coming or those opportunities stop coming.
um, Out of those, either in the pre-COVID years, the 2024, or the travels coming up, how many of those are, I don't want to say personal, but like, are any of those actual just like vacations, or is it all kind of work related?
That's a good question. I have always had a problem separating my professional and my personal life. It has led to strife in more than one occasion. But the problem is, I love what I do, and I like trying to make a positive difference. And so, most of the trips that I have a professional foundation, and I get a lot of personal enjoyment out of them. And so, that Ponza trip, for example, we're going to go a week early and rent a villa and have a relaxed time, but then stay and be at the rebreather conference. So it's a bit of a compromise.
Okay.
By doing fewer trips, you can also carve out a little bit more time for the personal stuff. But even that first day, I'm terrible at sitting around. So I'll still be looking for opportunities to dive while we're there and making the most of the time. But most of my trips have a professional foundation and then personal pleasure on top of them.
Okay. Are you speaking at the conference?
Yeah.
What's the topic? Obviously rebreathers, but is there a specific topic that you're speaking about?
Well, this is the eighth rebreather. I'm actually scheduled, I think, for four presentations, and one would be the physiological limitations of diving equipment. One is still up in the air because I requested they think about a change. But right now, I've got an overview presentation, hazards of rebreather diving, and then navigating between physiological benefit and harm in diving, and then thermal management and diving safety.
Okay.
So, to give you an example, second, navigating between physiological benefit and harm in diving. This to me is an important topic when it comes to the understanding of divers. A lot of divers, for example, have heard that dehydration is a major risk factor in decompression stress, which is probably not true, by the way. It is a risk factor, but unlike what you hear on some dive boats, it's definitely not the number one factor. You could be as dehydrated as a raisin. And if you don't have a provocative dive profile, you're not getting decompression sickness. So state of hydration is probably a bit player. I'm not saying it's unimportant, but for people who focus on drinking as much as they can, to avoid decompression sickness, they're at greater risk of immersion pulmonary edema because they're fluid loading too much. And so I think one of our problems as humans, we tend to think that if a little is good, more is better. And we see this in diving very clearly, that there's a fine line between too little and too much. And so the question is helping to make people understand, where is the sweet spot? What do I need to do to navigate between benefit and harm? And that to me is fun. And so I enjoy those presentations because people usually have a combination of clear understanding and some clear misunderstanding. And so it's fun to put these things together as a series of concepts that they can consider. Wait, that's not true. That's not what I heard. That's not what I read on the internet. Okay, what did you hear and why do you think it's true? And then you walk through why it may not be true. Or it's fun. Those things are, it's fun to see the light bulb go on. We're again back to the creativity of teaching. To see someone sometimes not believe you and then come to realize what it is that the discussion is about is very satisfying.
I have a kind of a two-part question. So obviously you've given a lot of presentations. I'm assuming these days you're probably, I would just assume that you're not nervous going into presentations, but how do you prepare for these presentations? And are there moments where you do get nervous, or the butterflies, the not stage fright, that's not what I want to say, but how do you prepare, and do you have moments like that you get a little nervous going up in front of, I'm assuming some of these places are a very esteemed group of people.
Yeah, and that's a good question. Fundamentally, I love having an audience. So it's a positive. So stage fright isn't a real concern, but there are certainly some audiences, especially if you're talking about something that may be a bit contentious, or if you know there are people who are going to disagree with you, even if you don't view it as contentious. There are times when you can be a little nervous, but I find once I start talking, no matter what, you get into the flow almost instantly. And I try to tell students who have to present that they're up there. And the most important thing, don't tell people what you didn't say, or don't apologize for what you don't say, because they don't know what you don't say. Just focus on what you are saying. And if you're prepared with what you say, it's all good. Now, to answer your question a different way, I realized I was super comfortable one day when I got to the podium and looked up at the audience and was about to start speaking. And for the first time, thought, wow, there are 500 people here. And I didn't even think about this once. And there are days that go like that too, where you're just so in the zone of thinking of your material that you don't have any butterflies. I think of lecturing now more as a conversation than a lecture. And so I think you go up and you're using a microphone, but you're basically just having a conversation, not unlike what we're having now, and sharing ideas and concepts. And if you can keep it relaxed rather than powering through slide after slide or detail after detail, I think it can bring people to your side. Even if they won't always agree with you, they can appreciate the effort, and you can be a little bit more relaxed because it's just a conversation.
Okay. Do you remember the first time? I mean, 500 people is a lot, but do you remember the first time that you had to speak in front of an audience? Was there nervousness there, or was it just kind of, let's go out and do this presentation?
Oh no, sure. There was nervousness. I mean, again, I'll go back to when I first started teaching swimming. You could say that I had an audience that were people that were older than me. I was in grade 10, they were in grade 12. That should be an intimidating point, but I remember not being intimidated because I knew the subject. They didn't. And so there was a comfort in the confidence of knowledge. So it depends. If you're really in control, if I'm in control of my content, I am much less nervous. But there have been times when I've had to lecture on topics that aren't of my primary interest. And those are often less dynamic. You're a little bit more nervous about it. So I've certainly had many presentations where I felt nervous and many where I haven't. It really varies depending on the audience and the topic. Once you get a portion of the audience that's familiar with you, it also helps a lot. Even if you have people who don't know you, if you've got a small number of people who are familiar with you in an audience, you can ride on that comfort, if you will. In this very small international community, you can get fairly well known, and that does make it easier. If people are comfortable with you when you come in, it's a lot easier than if you come in, they say, "Who is this idiot? Should I be listening to them or should I be leaving now?" It's nicer when people don't leave the room when you come to the podium. When you walk to the podium and the room clears, you're going to be a little bit less comfortable.
I could see that. I could see that. So, knowing the subject going in, how much preparation are you doing before you actually go? Are you like, I don't want to say writing a script and then kind of memorizing it? Do you just kind of go really research it and go off of what you know?
That is a superb question. And there are two parts to that answer. I spend a lot of time developing materials and I try to develop them when the spirit hits. Yesterday, for example, sometimes I'm actually really pleased if I come up with one new good slide. That to me is a good day. But yesterday, I ended up generating 8 slides, one or two which were really good, and the rest will be fine. And so I tend to develop things as I can. I don't like developing things under pressure. So I have a number of lectures that are always evolving. I'm always adding slides as something comes up or the spirit hits. When I'm actually preparing for a presentation, I will build a slide deck, and some people watch me and they wonder, what the hell are you doing? Because I will just be staring at my screen and then slowly advance. I never write out lectures. I never practice exactly what I'm going to say. Instead, I look at a slide and I think of usually a few combinations of things I could say, but I never tie myself down to a given order or an absolute precise exact content for the whole slide. So, in a way, I'm experiencing the slide with the audience because it is not a memorized, read off thing. Instead, I just look at my slide and I think that point, I know what could be an example. This point, I know what could be an example. And then, depending on the feel of the audience, I'll sometimes go into more detail, less detail, an example, or skip the example to reflect the energy I feel in the room. And so for me, I like the fact that I never truly know exactly what's going to come out. Now, it can get you in trouble because there have been a lot of times where to get a laugh out of the room, I will sometimes say things maybe a little bit more fervently than might be judicial. But you're doing it to get a laugh or to go with the flow. And sometimes you have minor regrets. That's when you're glad they're not recorded. When they are recorded, well, you live with it. There are certainly times when I have even spoken for the camera. I think at Rebreather Forum 4, I remember saying something that, oh, this is being recorded, so you heard that here. And yeah, it was a little bit strong, but ah, we have to have fun in life. I think another one of my favorite sayings is it's a very short distance between aha and haha. So if you can make people laugh, you can keep them engaged in material. And so I think it is important. It's important to engage, not just to deliver content. And so that's a lot of what I try to do. I try to think of ways that I could explain it so I can see the lights go on in a fair number of the audience. But if the lights aren't going on, I want to have a backup plan to try to approach it a different way with a different example, a different scenario, or different amount of detail. And so I try to make it as, even if it's not interactive of the audience asking questions in real time, they are asking questions in real time because I can see their faces and you can read confusion, satisfaction, disagreement, and you can adapt in real time to respond. And that's fun. That is when lecturing is a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's gotta be to see the light bulb moment is always fun, but to see the confusion into the light bulb moment, it's gotta be a very it's gotta be a very gratifying situation.
It is. And sometimes it's a good thing to create. Sometimes if you ask a question that people do find confusing, it focuses their attention. And then when you explain it, it is more powerful than if you just explained it directly without that setup. And
Okay.
that I do believe is quite powerful. As your example of when you did your open water training, sometimes people don't know what's important and what isn't important. We can do a better job of making people know what's important by setting things up properly. And again, that's the art of teaching.
Yeah, no, I love that. So I have one more question for you, and then I will let you go. I appreciate your time. As someone that has spent quite a bit of time as a diving officer, what advice could you give to a person that maybe is about to go into that position or is thinking about that position? What advice was the best piece of advice that you could give to that person?
I can actually tell you a story about that. One of the first time I dived in the Antarctic was 1990. And when I came off the ice, I was invited to give a talk at the local Natural History Museum. And this was actually pretty cool because when I was an undergraduate in zoology, I went and saw a fellow named Ian Sterling, who is a world expert in polar bears, give a presentation in this room. And I thought to myself then, I would love to give a presentation in this lecture hall because there's a beautiful wood lined lecture hall, I think 150 or 200 seats. And I just had that thought, wow, wouldn't that be cool? And so, flash forward almost 10 years later, 9 years later, I was invited to give a lecture in that hall. And it was cool. There was a woman in the audience who, after the talk, introduced me to her daughter. This woman's daughter wanted to become a marine biologist. She wanted to do field biology. And so she was saying, what can I do? And I told her exactly what I tell all students: try to get as well rounded skill wise as you can. If you want to do field biology, take a course to learn how to fix outboard motors or any other kind of engine that might be used. Do your first aid, do your outdoor survival, do everything you can to be well rounded so you become an asset to the program. This was a girl who was in grade 10 at the time. She listened, she nodded. It was very interesting. And damn, if she didn't become a PhD biologist. And she followed up quite a few years later and was talking about some of the things she did. And she did end up pursuing those endeavors. And she did end up developing all of those ancillary skills that made her attractive as a hiree, and it worked for her professionally. And so that's what I tell everybody now. The trick is realize that life is that web that I mentioned earlier. There is an infinite number of ways to get to the end point. Your best preparation is to have as much flexibility as possible so you're able to move forward in a positive direction, even if it isn't quite the direction that you thought it would be. And that to me is the picture for a good life, because we often don't know where we'll end up. But if we do what we can to prepare so we can move forward in any positive direction, I think it can lead to neat opportunities. So that's what I tell people.
That is absolutely, absolutely amazing advice. No, I love that. Just go with the flow, basically.
Well, go with the flow, but be in a position to do well in whatever you're doing.
No, that's absolutely great advice. Well, Neal, I really, really want to thank you for coming onto the podcast today again, and I'm glad there was no tech issues this time. So it worked out a little.
You haven't played back the recording yet. You don't know.
Yeah.
We
um,
may have been talking in the air.
but no, I really, really appreciate it, and I look forward to having you back on. And I just got to come up with some ideas for some roundtables, and but no, this has been absolutely wonderful. I really, really appreciate you coming on to the podcast today.
Well, I appreciate your effort in doing this. I think it is good, and you're able to reach a wide community, and that's fantastic. So you never know what young person you're going to encourage to move forward in a positive way. So keep it up.
Off Gassing, a scuba podcast.